Hey guys, I'm Michael, and as Thomas mentioned, I created NGUI. I'm on a couple of other things, but NGUI seems to be the one that people remember me for. I'm not sure why. So, the title of my presentation is DNFGUI, the myth, the legend. I'm sure some of you already know what DNF is all about, but it's not working. Dude, come on. Give it. Mine. Awesome. Technical issues. Gotta love those. Excellent. And I should probably look at, yeah. So, when we first posted the description of this talk, people started wondering, what does DNF actually mean? And community actually offered their own examples or explanations of what it means. Did not finish GUI. The new fascisling GUI. I'm not even sure what that means. The new freaking GUI. Yes. My reaction to all of these was, what? Well, of course, DNF stands for Duke Nukem Forever. Because let's face it, our UI is taking a while, right? And this is actually the name that was given to it by our community, and at Unity we just went along with it internally. I mean, why not? We don't really care. So anyway, allow me to give you a brief history of all the UI systems at Unity. There were quite a few, actually, and more that I'm going to cover, but the first one was obviously the immediate Mode GUI. That is the UI system that is very programmer-centric. And you have to write code in order to actually see stuff appear on a screen. So in other words, artists loved it. And the way immediate mode worked is actually you wrote code and only then it appeared on the screen and it was not retained. From one screen to the next, it would not be there unless the code was actually there running every single update. So obviously, it was not very performant. So the next iteration of the UI system was actually called ArenMook, which is short for Retained Mode GUI. The Retained Mode GUI actually preserves stuff from one screen to the next. And it was obviously better, because you could actually design things in real time, and you could actually see stuff appear on the screen. And for artists, it was definitely easier to work with. Unfortunately, it also kind of neglected a couple of things in the process. So I will go over them. Retained Mode GUI had a bit of a rigid architecture. Things like buttons, for example, they were meant for very specific things. Like a button had several different states, like for example, hover state, press state, and disable state, I guess, normal state. And they were all about changing images, essentially. From one to the next, it would change the image of the button, and you couldn't really do things like you could in NGUI, like for example, a simple change of a color of a button. Stuff like that was actually a lot more difficult. Yeah, but regardless, so this actually is the system that was supposed to ship in Unity 3, and that clearly happened, as you can see. But yeah, when I came on board in Unity last year, I obviously was coming from a UI background, per se, because of NGUI. And I had certain concerns, shall we say, about the retained mode itself. Like GUI transform, for example. The retained mode GUI did not really like using the existing transform for some reason, and it had a different transform instead, so sort of like a 2D version of the transform. And it kind of makes sense for the position and sorry, not the position, the size of the sprite. But why duplicate the position, for example, or why have anchors be embedded in every single widget? That was not quite necessary. Another problem with the retain mode GUI was the screen size support. Retain mode GUI was actually always pixel perfect, and you couldn't really do things like create one resolution that fits one screen that actually fits all the resolutions. Or if you could, it was actually a lot more difficult than it was in other systems. Scrolling. Yeah, and another thing. There we go. HD NSD atlas swapping was also quite difficult because retain mode GUI was actually referencing individual textures rather than sprites or atlases. So it essentially meant that in order to swap from HD to SD, you actually had to go through every single widget on the screen and actually change their textures, which was not ideal at all. Dynamic UIs. Yeah. The last nail in the coffin for the retain mode GUI was actually the inability to create UIs from code. It was actually really, really difficult. Some things were not exposed. It was obvious that the retain mode GUI was actually intended for artists, but in the process, it also happened to abandon the developers, which kind of sucked because I'm a developer. So in the end, we decided that NGUI was actually easier, and we ended up scrapping it. And this is when the Unity's new GUI was actually born. The idea was simple. Take an existing solution, that being NGUI, and make it better. I mean, it is a decent solution, and a lot of people seem to like it. So why not just make it better? Why reinvent the wheel? Why start from scratch? So we did just that. Unfortunately, there were a couple of issues within GUI. Z and depth issues being like one of them, probably on top of the list of everything else. Those of you who actually created user interface solutions within GUI probably know that if you are adjusting the order of things when they appear on the screen, by default, it is supposed to be done with adjusting the depth. Unfortunately, if you happen to have more than one panel on the screen or more than one atlas in use, or a dynamic font for that matter, it happens to break and things get a little hairy. And another issue, atlases kind of suck. And it would be ideally excellent if you could just specify a sprite for every single widget and have the atlasing done for you in the background, wouldn't it? Why have to create an atlas beforehand? We wanted to do that with the new UI system. Nested widgets was another problem within GUI. In order to actually do simple things like, for example, create a button where you have a background and inside of it you have a label, you couldn't really do that within GUI without first creating a parent object. And this way, the background and the label would actually be siblings rather than parented to one another. So if you were to move the background, the label would just stay in place. The reason you couldn't do that within GUI is because it used the transform scale in order to determine the size of the widget. And it was not ideal. We wanted to specify width and height ourselves, basically, in this new UI system. Square clipping is kind of another issue, in my opinion. It's not as big of an issue as others, but still. You couldn't really do non-square clipping in a GUI. So if you wanted to do something like round edges, where widgets get cut off, or, I don't know, part of the window cut out for whatever reason, you couldn't do that. Because in a GUI, you specified a rectangle, essentially, and everything was clipped inside of it. Labels and fonts is another issue. In NGUI, you had to specify an existing, or like a font prefab, essentially. You couldn't specify a TrueType font directly. And it was a bit of a pain in the ass because you had to create a UI font and work with that. It was just an extra step that could have been avoided. And it was a very obvious issue with the dynamic fonts. And the dynamic fonts and GUI didn't mix very well if you happen to use 3D UIs, which goes back to Z depth issues again. But anyway, let's talk about the future instead of the past. What we ended up doing is starting with NGUI, as I mentioned. However, we decided to fix all the issues with it and rewrite parts of it in order to make it awesome. We started with the event system. Those of you who actually use NGUI probably already are familiar with UI camera and how it is able to send out events. We wanted something like that embedded in Unity from the get-go without having to do anything. The new event system is actually very extensible on NGUI. So you can actually create your own raycasts into existing UI geometry instead of having to create colliders. And that's exactly what the UI system does. It does not use any colliders at all. The new event system actually handles mouse, touch, and controllers automatically for you as well. And if you happen to be creating a user interface that is supposed to be controlled with both mouse and a controller at the same time, you can do it. It's not a problem. And it actually even figures things out for you. Like when you're pressing left, it actually figures out which button is on the left side and actually selects that one for you. It's actually fairly convenient. Event bubbling is another feature that's actually pretty cool. If you are pressing on a widget, say for example a label inside a button, and this label doesn't have an event handler on it for a press event, the event simply goes to the parent, which if it happens to be a button, will get handled. Okay. Multiple event triggers is another cool thing. Like in the screenshot here, you can actually see that there's a section for on-click notification, and you can actually add multiple events right there instead of having to create multiple UI buttons like you had to do in NGUI, which is a pain in the ass. So, Unity's new GUI system. Let's talk about that. First of all, it is sprite-based. It is not atlas-based, which means that your widgets actually reference sprites, just like you would in the 2D system. It also means that aside of a lot of issues being fixed, all the atlasing is actually getting done for you behind the scenes. And you can do cool things like specify custom material effects on different widgets. Like for example, in a screenshot, there are stripes specified on the sliders, and those stripes actually move when you play with the demo. Automatic atlasing and batching, I actually mentioned that. But in addition to what I mentioned, so Z depth issues are actually completely gone in this UI system. Our system is actually powerful enough to determine what is in front of what and actually batch everything accordingly. So you get the minimized draw calls while at the same time having complete freedom. And you can do cool things, like in this case, in the screenshot, you can actually see that this is a tilted window, so it is a 3D window, and yet you have a scrollable panel inside of it. And unlike NGUI, which breaks when you happen to tilt the window, because it changes the draw order, in this UI system, it does not. It works perfectly fine. Yeah, set and depth is fixed. Width, height, and not scale. Yeah, in this screenshot, you can actually see that we are specifying width and height on a sprite, rather than using the transform scale. This allows us to nest widgets and do other things quite a bit easier than you would in NGUI. Dynamic fonts by default. In addition to the obvious benefit of having the dynamic fonts work correctly, you can actually do cool things like embed size tags, for example, and other rich text inside your labels. Like in this case, you can actually see a label that changed its size mid-sentence. And the clipping is actually done using stencils, which were first introduced in a recent version of Unity. In this case, I just decided to randomly cut out a part of the window because I didn't like it. So it looks like there's a chunk missing. And this is done simply by having one of the sprites draw using a material that writes the stencil buffers, essentially. And the rest of the UI uses that stencil buffer. Of course, there's a bit more. Yeah, one other thing I probably should mention before ending this presentation is the fact that this UI system is not a black box. ArenGUI was a black box. You couldn't really modify the code. And GUI was completely open source. You could just modify whatever you wanted to suit your needs. With this UI system, we wanted a compromise. And the majority of the UI is actually open and modifiable for you. We're not quite sure where we're going to put it just yet, whether it's going to be in standard assets or if we're going to put it on a GitHub repository somewhere, but you will have full access to the source code. So if you don't like something, you can change it. Well, there are other cool features, of course, but time is limited. So I'm just going to show you the UI in action. Oops, sorry. Whoa. This is terrible. What is going on? Yeah, sort of, kind of. It's good enough. Examples. So here we have a start scene that just loads other examples. I just wanted to add some explosions to this, so why not? I just added some. The UI is always cooler with explosions. This scene actually shows, oh man, that's ugly. Sort of better, but not really, but whatever. Yeah, this UI actually shows a bunch of different widgets in action, different sliders with origin, you know, what you would expect, except a bit more. And of course, stuff like selection, I mean, why not? Since you can actually parent things and anchor things freely without worrying about scales and stuff, you can actually do things like attach list label to, say, right here. And man, this is difficult to work with. UI, anchor, anchor, anchor. I want to attach it to here. Damn. Okay, there we go. There, for down. Go down. I hate working with small resolutions. So anyway, I attached an anchor here and specified the foreground to be the origin. And instead of the center, it's going to be like the left side. And okay, this example does not work quite right. There we go. Quite easy. Anyway, moving on to the next one. Get rid of this. Yeah, in this example, I just have, remember how I mentioned the material effects on different widgets? In this case, I actually have stripes going across all the windows, just for the fun of it. And this is the animated sliders that I was talking about. Stuff like this you can actually do in NGUI, which is always cool. Moving forward, it's good. And of course, lighting. Just to make it cooler, I mean, why not add a normal map to the UI? You can do that. And same thing. I'm just changing the light color in this case. Some elements are actually affected by the light, others are not. It depends on which shader you specify. If you specify an unlit shader, like these widgets up top here, then they're obviously not going to be affected. And that's just a prism effect. Same thing, custom material on a background of the window creates a cool looking prism effect. Just to add a more interesting effect to normal mapping, I made it refractive. Why not? And this is the stencil example I was talking about. See, things actually get cut off. And of course, since this is a widget, just like any other, you can move it around. Now, the reason the text is not getting clipped is because the shader that's on the text was not set to use the stencil. However, that's because the material is not actually specified. But if I was to specify material, then I could do whatever I want, including getting it clipped. And speaking of clipping, that's a scroll view. As you can kind of see, there's some rounded edges here. It's actually done using just another sprite. And this guy. No, wait. Yeah, one of these. Scroll view area, I'm guessing this is one. So, or not. Anyway, one of these. There's a sprite here that actually just defines an area, and it has the stencil mask on it that cuts out everything else. It's actually done using, I think it's still one hierarchy. Yeah, one primary hierarchy. Anyways, that's that. So let's actually create some UIs. I'm just going to start with a new scene. And first thing I want to do is, I don't know, create a sprite here in the middle of the screen. Now, when you actually, what I did is use the shortcut, Alt-Shift-S, but of course you can do the same thing from the UI menu, just create a sprite. By default, if the UI hierarchy does not exist, it actually gets created for you. So everything that you need. Of course, the sprite is not actually visible right now. We should probably define something for it. In inspector, holy crap, it's tiny. We specify a sprite. I don't know, button, for example. Change the pivot. So there's a button, sort of, kind of. Of course, we can scale it, do whatever we want, position. Same as the 2D, basically. Of course, we can change it to be a different type, like a slice sprite, for example. Now it's more looking like a button. So let's add text to this pseudo button. Alt-Shift-L in this case, or just going through the menu, adds a label. Now I want to make this label black, and I also want it to be, say, I don't know, 40 in size. It's easier to see now. Of course, if I don't like this font, I can change it to something else. Now, these are TrueType fonts that you actually get to specify. So there, now there's a label. And I'm going to change this pivot to be center-based, position it in the middle, and resize bounds. There we go. Now, if I was to adjust this guy, since the label is actually parented to the button, it gets adjusted automatically. Now, adding functionality to this is actually fairly straightforward. Inspector, yeah. Widget event system is what actually does like pseudo raycasts into widgets and allows your widgets to actually receive events. So for example, in this case, if I wanted to create a button, I would switch to inspector, button. Yeah, so here I specify which widget it's supposed to be working with. Say I want to color the background. So I just drag and drop the sprite in here. And now when I hit play, it changes colors. Fairly straightforward. Now, of course, if I wanted to do something else, like change sprites instead, I would just specify this and get argument exceptions, cool times. But yeah, you'd be able to specify sprites here, and it'll just essentially act like an image button from NGUI. Yeah, there were no errors. There's nothing there. Now, for navigation, yeah, so if, for example, I wanted to create another button and move it here, you can actually set this to be select and enabled. So if you're creating like a controller-based game and you hit play right now, one of the buttons will be selected. And if I hit the up arrow key, another button will be selected. Now if I switch to a mouse and start working with the mouse, it'll behave as if I'm playing with the mouse-based system. But at the same time, if I start using the keyboard, it'll switch back to the keyboard. It's the same with the controller. Okay, we're getting close to the end time here. So anything in particular you guys want to see? I'm taking requests. Yeah, of course. You cannot do bitmap fonts, not right now. Everything is dynamic. The idea is since we have shader support, you can actually do whatever you want with the existing dynamic font. You don't actually need to bake anything in Photoshop. You just can create cool effects as it is. You mean, yeah. You can actually see the draw calls here. It's 2. Now, keep in mind, this is not actually very optimized right now still. We're still obviously working on it, and I'm not even sure if atlasing works right now. I don't think it does. So, I mean, there's obviously room for improvements, and, but none of those examples that I showed dip below 25 draw calls, I think, even with the special effects. Yeah. You can actually, it's the same thing with the 2D. You specify an atlas hint on the sprites, and it'll essentially control where they end up, which atlas they end up with. Or if you don't care, just leave it at default, and it'll just figure it out for you. Yes?
Projects are using NGUI, what would be like the upgrade from NGUI?
I've considered that. The actual system changed a lot, so I would like to do that, yes, but I cannot promise it right now. There will be something, but I cannot promise a one-to-one conversion. Layout features? Yeah, like a grid, for example. It's the same as NGUI. The code is essentially basically taken from NGUI, kind of. So if you wanted to do things like put buttons in a grid, there you go. I would just attach a grid, placement grid to it, and specify dimensions. And the same as in GUI, you hit reposition now and sort position them for you, and vertical, like that. It's primarily for like ease of use. It's not something you have to use. Yes?
When an event bubbles up, does it tell you what it originally hit, where it came from?
Where it came from?
So you have a table of buttons, and the event.
Yes. So when you actually have a button selected, and you have this on-click notification right here, you can actually see that in brackets it specifies the button. It's the same with everything else. With a slider, it'll be a slider. With a button, it'll be a button, checkbox, and so on. If you want. Yeah, but like I said, you can actually add multiple event handlers there if you want. And, do whatever you want. Yes?
How does this play with different screen resolutions?
It's, by default, it is pixel perfect unless you specify camera. Like if you actually look closer to, there we go, canvas thing, there's no camera drawing the UI right now. This is on the UI layer, I think. Yeah, the UI layer, the main camera is set to not draw the UI layer. So what happens right now is it's always pixel perfect and it gets drawn after everything else. It's handled by the canvas itself. However, you can actually specify an explicit camera exactly the same way you can in GUI. So if you were to create a 2D camera, some of the examples actually do that, it'll just draw using that camera instead. You specify it on here. So instead of overlay, you specify world, and then you can actually specify which camera to use. Yeah. Sorry, what? Yes. Localization, yes, it's built in.
So the sprite data, if I wanted to say deform that mesh using the skeletal system or something else, is the mesh data exposed?
It's not exposed currently, but it's not something difficult to do.
And with the widget system itself, you can actually create your own custom widgets. Basically, you override one function, which is like a fill function in NGUI, and you can specify your own custom geometry if you want. The idea is when you have sprites, you actually also have this UI renderer here, which is going to be called something else, by the way, so don't get comfortable. But the idea behind it, you essentially feed it vertices as well as the material that it should draw with, and it'll take care of everything for you. It doesn't have to be a widget in this case. It doesn't have to be UI. It can be whatever you want. Yep. Sorry, can you say that again? Yeah, well, the event system is completely exposed for you. So if you don't like the existing button script, you can either have it trigger something else. Like in this case, when I have a button, I can actually specify nothing for it to do absolutely nothing. And then I can do on-click behavior here, or I can actually create my own scripts that react to hover events. So it's really up to you. Non-rectangular texture support? Is that? Sorry? Oh, no, we haven't done that. You mean like curved and whatnot?
No, not that, but for example, having a cutout and having text.
Oh, yeah, like have it wrap around. We haven't done that yet. If we do, it would be actually pretty cool. Now that you give me the idea, but we'll see. Yeah. Yeah, well, in one of the scenes where the scene with the explosions I showed, I just created a sprite and just did my own sprite swapping. I mean, why not? It'll be actually easier when we fully integrate with the 2D team because we're kind of working in parallel right now. But yeah, for the time being, it's still doable. And we're actually 3 minutes over. Shit.
So thank you very much.
All right, if you guys have any more questions, just come by the hands-on lab and I'll answer them best I can.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.